Hello, I'm Harley Schlanger from the Schiller Institute. Welcome to this week's webcast with our founder and president, Helga Zepp-LaRouche. The Schiller Institute has just created a new petition which calls for an emergency summit among four powers, the United States, Russia, China, and India, to create a new Bretton Woods. This is something that is urgently needed. The financial system is in terrible shape. It's not just one thing. It's not just the Turkey problem or Argentina. It's the whole system. And it comes at a time when there's a political crisis in the world with the continuation of Russiagate. So it's absolutely crucial that steps be taken to address this. And the most important one would be a conference for a new Bretton Woods. Our listeners and viewers should read this petition and circulate it. And Helga, why don't you give people a sense of what's in it and what's the thought behind it?
Well, I think most people would agree that the world is in a complete mess. You have many different problems. You have the immediate danger of a new financial blowout, and there are analysts warning that there are storms over the United States, that you could have a complete financial collapse way before the midterm election. Then you have the emerging market reverse carry trade problem, which is hitting Turkey in particular, Argentina, but possibly others. Then you have the refugee crisis. You have the collapse of infrastructure as the collapse of the Genoa bridge demonstrates. Then you have the EU in disarray. And actually, the demographic curve in the United States is collapsing. You have the unbelievable figures of opium death in the United States per year. So most people in front of all of these, and I could probably make a longer list, would say, how can you remedy all of these things? There seems to be no solution. How can we possibly be in a safe world? Now, I think that there is a common denominator or a common thread which will not remedy everything at once, but which will put the world back in order so that you can actually start solving all of these problems. And, I think that the point which the reference point is when did the Western financial system go haywire? And my husband, the American economist and statesman Lyndon LaRouche, is probably the only economist who, when it happened, put his finger absolutely on the problem, namely when President Nixon, on the 15th of August 1971, canceled the fixed exchange rate system of the Bretton Woods system, decoupled the dollar from the gold, and started the monetarist neoliberal policies. Now, my husband at that point, who was not my husband yet then, but later became, he said, if one continues this monetarist neoliberal policies, sooner or later, it will end up in another depression, another danger of fascism, or the world will establish a just new world economic system. And he was absolutely on the mark in saying that. And he has been ever since absolutely consistently right in every of his economic prognosis. He predicted the 87 crash 1 week before the secondary mortgage crisis in the United States started to detonate, what became then 2007, 2008, Lehman Brothers, AIG bankruptcy, the big systemic crisis of 2008. 1 week before that happened, he made a video address where he said, this system is gone, and all what you will see is now the different symptoms coming to the surface. And he also predicted that the condition of the American infrastructure was in terrible shape and it would collapse. And exactly 1 week later, the bridge in Minnesota collapsed. Now, basically, over the years, my husband has repeatedly called for a reestablishment of the new Bretton Woods system to go back to Hamiltonian economics, to go back to a credit system, to basically, wipe out the casino economy, get rid of the derivative bubble, and go to national banking, have credit generation of sovereign governments, and then have an international credit system, by linking these different credit systems through clearance houses, so that you can have long-term investment in great projects as a remedy to all of these problems. Now, at a certain point, I mean, we were in 2007, we have happened to be in Turkey. As a matter of fact, we were invited by the then President or Prime Minister Özal, and my husband made a speech in Istanbul and then later in Ankara, where he said we need a concert of nations to go back to the sound criteria of the new Bretton Woods system. Now later, he specified that more and said the only combination of countries which have the power to undo the British imperial financial system based on the City of London and Wall Street would be a four-power combination of the United States, Russia, China, and India. So we have written this new petition, which calls actually on the leaders of these four countries not to be exclusive, but to have these four countries the core group of nations which would form a new Bretton Woods system, and then invite others, and all countries who would like to associate with that would be welcomed to join. Now, this is urgent. As I said, there are many people who say the next financial storm will hit well before the midterm election. There are many analysts who say the Fed, the Federal Reserve tapering, the so-called increase of interest rate, must urgently stop because it is about to blow out the debt bubble. Now, the Institute of International Finance in Washington just published figures that the total indebtedness of the world has become 247.2 trillion. And that represents an increase of 11.1% just for the last year. So we are sitting on a complete powder keg, and anything could trigger this collapse of the bubble, which, if not remedied, would then, the danger would be an economic chaos with unforeseeable consequences. So therefore, we are calling on you, our audience, and many other audiences around the world. Study this petition. If you agree with it in principle, that we need an urgent change in the monetary system, that we need to go back to a credit system and real economy, and that you need a powerful combination of countries to implement it, then sign this petition and circulate it as widely as you can, because we will translate this petition in as many languages as we can. And if you have language skills which are not obvious, please join us, help us to circulate this, because we want to have a worldwide mobilization of every country and every force, every person on the planet, to appeal to those leaders, namely President Trump, President Putin, President Xi Jinping, and Prime Minister Modi, to take this action, and preferably to use the UN General Assembly, which will start in September, to put this on the agenda.
Now, Helga, for those of our viewers who are not familiar with this, your husband and you also have emphasized repeatedly that the differences between a financial system based on monetarism as opposed to one which is based on credit for physical economy. If you could just summarize that briefly so people get a sense of why one tends toward bubbles and crash, and the other that we're seeing now, for example, with China's Belt and Road Initiative, is the basis of constant growth.
Well, what my husband recognized when Nixon decoupled the dollar from the gold backing and got rid of the fixed exchange rates, this was the first major step in the direction of the deregulation of the financial markets. This was then, escalated because Glass-Steagall was already undermined when Greenspan became head of the Federal Reserve, and eventually, when Glass-Steagall was repealed in 1999, this was then the real starting point for a complete deregulation of the financial markets, giving in many countries implementing legislations which would benefit the speculators and basically be at the expense of the real economy, of the common good, of a sound economy. So now you have a situation where this whole deregulation led to the big crisis in 2008, and there was for several weeks a complete shock. I remember very well that people, even Sarkozy, thought, that the French president at that time, that this was it, that the system would just collapse. And that shock, unfortunately, didn't last very long, because already at the next G20 meeting in Washington in November, basically they decided to fix it, to just use the quantitative easing, to use the, eventually zero interest rate, just pumping money into the system to prolong this system, which benefits the speculators and which is at the expense of the common good of the people, of social services, of medical services, of cheap labor, and basically ruining the economies in their substance. So since there was nothing done after 2008 to get rid of the root causes of the systemic crisis of 2008, we are now 10 years later, where this system is much more indebted. It's about 40 or more % indebted than it was in 2008. And you have now a bubble which is about to detonate. Now, obviously, there was a lot of looting, a lot of austerity, a lot of low wages, unemployment. And if you contrast that with what China has been doing with the Chinese model of economy, where they uplifted 800 million people in the last 40 years out of poverty. They have created a large, growing middle class, a growing domestic market. They have launched the Belt and Road Initiative, the new Silk Road, bringing economic development to many countries in Eurasia, in Africa, in Latin America. And this is just a completely different approach. And in the recent period, China has moved very forcefully to forbid speculation, to forbid Chinese investors to engage in speculation abroad. And obviously, there are many countries aware of the financial system, or the weakness of the financial system in the West, and they are preparing, to protect themselves against it. So we are sitting on a complete powder keg. For example, because of the unfortunate war of sanctions the United States is launching against many countries in the world, these countries are not sitting idle by, but they start to dump US treasuries. And this is an amazing thing. It's not just Russia and Turkey who started to go out of US treasuries. Japan got rid of, I think, 83 billion worth of US treasuries in the last year. China started to do it. They have 113 trillion US treasuries. If they would start dumping those in a grand style, it would probably blow out the system right there. Also, several countries have started to go out of the dollar for international trade and start to trade in national currencies. And one can actually see, that this is the beginning of the formation of a new economic system, which is supposed to safeguard against the danger of a blowout. So there is no time to lose. I think President Trump has spoken very favorably of the American system of economy. He mentioned Alexander Hamilton, Henry C. Carey, Lincoln. And what people don't know is that the American system of economy, as it was developed by Hamilton, is actually very similar in principle to the Chinese economic model. Most people have no inkling that that's the case, but it's a matter of fact, because it's the same idea that the state has the power and the right to give credit for investments in the physical economy, provided these investments are based on sound scientific principles, meaning that they have to lead to an increase in productivity and an increase in the capacity of the labor power to go along with these increases in productivity. And as long as these principles are safeguarded, there is no reason to think that credit generation by governments is inflationary. To the contrary, it works as a deflationary effect because it creates new levels of technology and therefore is actually working in a deflationary way. So that is what is very urgently to understand and to act on, because we need the kind of international reform to prevent a blowout into chaos.
One of the points you made earlier is that with the post-Bretton Woods system, there was a big push for deregulation, also the so-called free trade agreements. And one of the other aspects was a privatization. And this plays into the whole situation in Italy. There's a lot of finger pointing going on, but it does appear that this bridge collapse was completely avoidable, except for the policies of the European Union and privatization, isn't it?
Well, it's not just the European Union. I mean, it used to be that in most European nations, infrastructure belonged to the responsibilities of the state. And that is actually what it should be, because basic infrastructure is not bringing an immediate profit. Infrastructure creates the precondition for industry, for agriculture, for trade to function. And therefore, when the economy went well, it was always the obligation of the state to take care of it and invest in it. Now, that was the case until 1992, when there was a very infamous meeting on the yacht of Queen Elizabeth, the Britannica, which was actually, a conspiratorial meeting of, many of the money bags and financial bigwigs, and they decided not only to go for a huge privatization of all kinds of things, of state-owned industries, of infrastructure, of many things which previously were part of the official public works, and they started to speculate. They speculated the lira down by 30%, and then had foreign investors buy up these things for very cheap. And this was a real conspiracy. And one of the people who was absolutely involved in that was Mario Draghi, who later became leading banker in Goldman Sachs. And now he is the head of the European Central Bank, who has ordered many times huge austerity programs to Italy, which is one of the reasons why you have the present government in Italy consisting out of this coalition of the Lega North and the Five Star parties, who are totally Euro-critic, because they have seen what the EU austerity policy did to the Italian economy. So it is the combination of these two things, privatization of things which shouldn't be private, and massive austerity, which led to non-investment in the repair. Now, infrastructure has only a certain lifespan. Depending what categories you are dealing with, infrastructure is, needs to be repaired after 40 or 50 years, or even 20 years or 80 years. But in the case of this bridge, which was privatized, it belongs to a larger autorway called Autostrada, owned by the Benetton family. And now it turns out that the inspectors, or the people who were inspecting the condition of the bridge, had already noted that the bridge was in urgent need for repair. So rather than starting this repair immediately, the owners of this private infrastructure decided to postpone the beginning of the repair until September, when the main holiday traffic, namely the big profit, would be over, because this is a toll booth system, and naturally this bridge goes to the port of Genoa, and then all the islands and also to France. So a lot of tourists and a lot of people who go to the beaches would travel in the summertime over this bridge. And obviously this looting of this big profit was the reason why the repair was postponed. This is all now subject under investigation. And, there is a big move by the Italian government to renationalize this infrastructure, which is causing naturally a huge freak out on the side of the privatizers. But I think this is a very interesting development, which, is not only affecting Italy, but, now there's a big debate about the condition of bridges and other infrastructure in Germany. And it turns out that 12% of all bridges in Germany are regarded highly unsafe. And the same thing could happen there any moment. That naturally the infrastructure in the United States is in an absolutely abysmal condition. So I think that this is really a reflection of the failure of the policies which started in 1971 with the collapse or with the abandoning, with the destruction of Bretton Woods through Nixon. And, we need an urgent reversal of this policy, and is why this petition is circulating.
I want to take up a couple aspects of the continuing unfolding of the Russiagate story. This week, President Trump lifted the security clearance of John Brennan. This is, in our opinion, long overdue, but it caused an enormous panic. Brennan wrote an op-ed in the New York Times asserting that Trump colluded, again, without presenting any evidence. Also, Peter Strzok was fired. We're talking about a 90-day perspective now for the economy and the security side of this, ending Russiagate. Where do things stand on that, Helga?
Well, I mean, the lawyer of President Trump, Giuliani, has basically said that it's high time that Brennan is being put in front of a grand jury investigation. And he said that either Mueller comes up with something to interview President Trump by the 1st of September, or it should be shut down, because otherwise it's an interference in the midterm election. So, there are several congressional committees who are working despite the summer break, high time, interviewing people under subpoena. And obviously, everything centers on the role of the British colluding with the Obama intelligence apparatus in creating this coup attempt against President Trump. Now, the reason why we are in a 90-day countdown, so to speak, is because obviously there is right now this investigation pointing to the interference of the British government, the British MI6, the CGHQ, the equivalent of the NSA, of the British Secret Services, into the US election. And this is the biggest scandal. This is the biggest scandal in the history of the United States. And if this investigation would be shut down, I think the United States would probably never recover from it. It's very clear by the hysteria of the Democrats and some neocons in the Republican Party, but especially also the so-called mainstream media, that they are completely freaked out because they all were part of this collusion. I mean, the mass media were, really, in German, there's this word gleichgeschaltet. I don't know the word in English, maybe Harley you can say. This is the term which was used for the unified line of the media during the Goebbels period in Nazi Germany. And when you look at the behavior of the US media, now 300 newspapers launched this absolutely incredible attack against Trump. I think it was yesterday. You have the same phenomena of Gleichschaltung. And, anybody who thinks that this is a conspiracy theory, well, it's 300 papers who coordinate their action. You can call that a conspiracy or a plan or whatever you want to call it. But, these papers, these media are covering up for the biggest scandal in the history of the United States and trying to give it a spin so that the ordinary people wouldn't look through it. Now, therefore, it is extremely urgent that the Congress acts and that the population acts to back up Trump to declassify all of these documents which have to do with Christopher Steele, which have to do with the FISA court warrants. All of these things must be declassified. And there is also a new article by the expert on this matter, namely Barbara Boyd, with the title "The Fish Stinks from the Head," where she gives an update about the latest inconsistencies in the stories of Peter Strzok, of Lisa Page, of all of these people participating in this. And you should get this paper. You can go to the LaRouche PEC website. You can download it. You should circulate it as widely as possible, because that is the very best thing you can do, that the truth is coming out and coming into the right hands of the people who have to understand what is really going on in this unbelievable story.
Now, Helga, we're running a little short on time, so I want to touch on a few things rather quickly. There are some very important other developments, starting with Russia. Prime Minister Medvedev made a very strong statement about the new sanctions, that this is an act of economic warfare. What would you say about that?
Well, obviously, this is an effort by the bipartisan, forces in the Senate to take the power of the president to define foreign policy away. It is very clear that after Trump met with Putin in Helsinki, the hysteria completely overboarded. And obviously, this is an effort by the Senate to continue what they started with the so-called Casca bill last summer, by having what Lindsey Graham called sanctions from hell. Now, what these sanctions of hell, if they would eventually be all implemented down the road until November, would basically ban Russian banks from international work. It would ban the trading with Russian bonds. And obviously, it would completely cripple the Russian economy, at least under the present circumstances. And therefore, Prime Minister Medvedev called this a declaration of war, economic war, and that Russia will take absolutely decisive countermeasures. Now, part of these countermeasures we already saw, because Foreign Minister Lavrov was in Ankara discussing with Erdogan and others the shift away from the dollar into the trade in the national currencies. Now, obviously, if this thing escalates, if the trade war with China escalates with sanctions, with all kinds of countries, I mean, this could, add to an uncontrollable situation. And therefore, we have been insisting that the Muellergate operation against Trump must be shut down immediately, because Trump's natural impulse is to seek a better relationship with Russia. And he was doing very well with Xi Jinping before. And I think under the urgency of this whole situation, the possibility of such a four-power agreement, which then would be supported by many other nations in the world, is an absolutely urgent but also realistic possibility. It must happen now.
And again, people should go to the Schiller Institute website and get the new petition that calls for an emergency summit for a four-power meeting to enact a new Bretton Woods. Helga, two things quickly on the positive side, one of which is actually quite delightful. You have the South Korea, North Korea talks coming up, President Moon meeting with President Kim. And then also President Putin has been invited back to Austria under interesting circumstances. What do you think of those things?
Well, first of all, President Moon of South Korea has launched a really very interesting initiative in preparation to him going to Pyongyang in about 1 month. He has proposed a Northeast Asia economic railway initiative, whereby the railway systems of South and North Korea, Russia and China would be integrated and be the basis of a major economic program. So I think this is a very good thing. And despite the media who basically poo-poo this whole thing all the time and say this is not working, it is working, both from the Trump administration, from Russia, from South Korea, from China. They all say it is absolutely proceeding as it was discussed between Trump and Kim Jong-un in Singapore, and it is actually on a good way. So this is a very good development. And the last thing you mentioned, I find actually quite amusing, because Putin, on his way to Germany, where he will meet Chancellor Merkel tomorrow, dropped by, or is dropping by, a wedding party of the Austrian Foreign Minister Karin Kneißl, who at the Putin visit a couple of months ago in Vienna, she invited him, and he just said, yes, I come, and now he's coming. And obviously, in the middle of this whole hysteria, the fact that the Austrian foreign minister invites Putin to her wedding is actually quite, it's a human thing. It should be normal. It should make people happy. But in the times of Marco Rubio going haywire, and Lindsey Graham and many other people being in a worse than McCarthy fit, naturally it causes completely ripples. But hopefully these kinds of human things will occur many in the future when we have a new paradigm. So I think people should enjoy it.
Absolutely. Helga, is there anything else you want to cover?
No, I just would really like people to look at this petition. This is, has the potential of reaching the relevant heads of state if enough people in enough countries are signing it, because we want to change the agenda. And right now the only way how you can address all of these many problems, the refugee crisis, to change the credit availability for rebuilding the economy. I mean, if people have questions, please send us an email. If you don't understand why this is the solution to the pre-step for all solutions, contact us, get in a discussion with us. But you need to raise the level of political discussion on a higher level. If you just try to solve each little problem within its setting, you cannot do it. And Einstein said, do not think that you can solve major problems with the same method which were the reason for it to exist in the first place. You need a different method. And what we are here proposing is a different method to go to a higher level of reason, of strategic cooperation. And I do not think it's impossible, because you already have the emergence of a new economic system anyway. The BRICS, the new Silk Road, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, the Eurasian Economic Union. There are already many processes in the direction of a new economic financial architecture. But this is the absolutely necessary step to catapult it on the level it needs to be, namely the strategic level. So please help us to circulate and sign and get many signatures under this petition.
Well, thank you very much, Helga, and we'll see you next week.
Yes, hopefully next week.